The church basement door. The hymnals were still open on the pews when Hannah Lewis disappeared. On November 6, 1983, in the mill town of Ashford, Pennsylvania, population 3,912, the late autumn Sunday began with a gray drizzle that slicked the leaves along Maple Street and turned the church steps into a film of cold, wet stone. At 12:17 p.m., as the last notes of Amazing Grace drifted up into the rafters of First Ashford Methodist, and the congregation filtered toward the fellowship hall for coffee and store-bought cookies, 17-year-old Hannah told her best friend she would just run down to the basement for a minute to grab a box of decorations for the youth fundraiser. She never came back. Hannah had grown up in that church. Her baby picture still hung in the nursery hallway, taped to a fading construction paper lamb from a long-ago Christmas pageant. She sang alto in the youth choir, helped with vacation Bible school every summer, and knew every creaking board and drafty corner of the 100-year-old brick building at the corner of Maple and 3rd. It was the kind of place where people didn't get lost, where children were trusted to roam the hallways during coffee hour while parents refilled styrofoam cups and gossiped about layoffs at the paper mill. The church basement door stood at the end of a narrow corridor behind the sanctuary. A heavy wooden door painted a dull, institutional beige, its brass knob worn smooth by decades of hands. Just above the knob, a small iron slide bolt had been installed in the 1950s after a rash of petty thefts. Beneath the knob at knee level, a second, sturdier deadbolt had been added in 1978 when the church's insurance company insisted on better security for the rummage sale donations stored downstairs. The door opened inward onto a steep flight of concrete steps and a wide, low-ceilinged basement lined with Sunday schoolrooms, storage closets, and a fellowship hall that smelled faintly of coffee, wax, and old hymnals. On that damp November Sunday, the slide bolt and the deadbolt were both in the unlocked position when Hannah turned the knob and disappeared from the world. The timeline would be reconstructed later with a precision that felt cruelly inadequate compared to the enormity of what had happened. At 12:14 p.m., the final hymn ended. At 12:15, Pastor Douglas Harper delivered the benediction, his calm baritone blessing the congregation as they closed their hymnals and reached for coats. At 12:16, in the back pew, Hannah leaned close to her friend Mary Crawford, whispering something that made Mary roll her eyes and nudge her with an elbow. At 12:17, as people began filing out of the sanctuary, Mary watched Hannah slip down the side aisle, tugging at the hem of her second-hand denim jacket. Her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that still smelled faintly of the cheap apple-scented shampoo she'd been using since middle school. At 12:18, Mary saw the beige door at the end of the corridor swing gently shut behind her friend. No one would see Hannah again. In the swirl of post-service small talk, no one noticed her absence immediately. Parents wrangled children into coats, older members lingered to comment on the weather and the Steelers game, and the church ladies arranged store-bought cookies and supermarket sheet cake on folding tables in the fellowship hall. The coffee urn sputtered and hissed, filling styrofoam cups with burnt-smelling dark liquid as people queued up, balancing plates and bulletins and car keys. Mary waited. She poured herself coffee she wouldn't drink, ate half a cookie without tasting it, and kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the sanctuary, expecting to see Hannah reappear with a cardboard box in her arms, complaining about spiders in the basement or the smell of the old boiler. At 12:31 p.m., Mary checked the women's restroom. At 12:35, she peeked into the sanctuary where the last of the older congregants were slowly making their way toward the doors. At 12:38, she mentioned casually to her mother that Hannah had gone to get decorations and hadn't come back yet. Her mother, distracted by a conversation about a neighbor's knee surgery, waved it off. At 12:44, Mary walked down the quiet hallway toward the beige door and tried the knob. It turned easily under her hand, the hinges giving off their familiar soft groan as the door opened inward. Cold, slightly damp air spilled up from the darkness below. The single bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs was off. Mary stood at the top step and called into the shadowed space, her voice echoing strangely off the concrete walls. "Hannah? You down there?" She waited. Silence answered. Somewhere deeper in the basement, a furnace kicked on, filling the stillness with a low mechanical hum. Mary swallowed against a sudden tightness in her throat, flicked the light switch at the top of the stairs and watched the bulb at the bottom flicker to life. The stairwell and a slice of the basement floor sprang into pale yellow existence. There was nothing there. No box, no movement, no sign of her friend. For a moment, Mary considered going down herself. Then she glanced back over her shoulder toward the fellowship hall, where the comforting noise of conversation and clinking cups filtered faintly down the corridor. Something about the quiet at the top of those stairs unnerved her in a way she couldn't explain. She switched the light off again, pulled the door mostly shut, and told herself that Hannah had probably gotten distracted helping someone else, or had gone out to the parking lot to talk to one of the boys from youth group. At 12:52 p.m., Mary finally walked over to where Hannah's mother, Elaine Lewis, stood talking to Pastor Harper in the fellowship hall. She waited until there was a pause in the conversation, and then spoke the sentence that would mark the beginning of Ashford's longest-running mystery. "Mom, have you seen Hannah?" She went down to the basement, like a half hour ago, and never came back up. At first, no one panicked. Missing teenagers in 1983 were more often assumed to be temporarily wayward than in immediate danger. Elaine frowned, wiping crumbs from her hands onto a napkin, and scanned the fellowship hall. "She's probably out back with the others," she said, already half turning toward the exit. "She knows we're supposed to go straight to your grandmother's." But there was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Together, Elaine and Mary checked the restrooms again, the nursery, the Sunday school rooms upstairs. They walked out the side door into the small gravel parking lot where rusted Chevrolets and Ford pickups sat beneath dripping maple trees. A cluster of teenagers leaned against the low stone wall by the alley, passing around a crumpled pack of cigarettes and laughing too loudly. None of them had seen Hannah. It was 1:06 p.m. when Elaine, now openly worried, returned to the church's interior hallway and found Pastor Harper talking with the head usher about the next month's schedule. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Doug, have you seen Hannah?" "She went to the basement to get the youth group decorations and she never came back." The pastor blinked behind his glasses, his mind still on hymn selections and committee meetings. "The basement," he repeated, as if the word itself were unfamiliar. "Just now?" "Nearly an hour ago," Elaine said. Mary saw her go through the door. It was at that moment, that precise sliver of time, that the atmosphere inside First Ashford Methodist shifted almost imperceptibly from ordinary post-service bustle into something else, something charged and tense and slightly unreal. The people still lingering over coffee noticed it first in the way the pastor's voice changed when he called for the church trustees, in the way Elaine's hand shook as she pushed her hair back from her face, in the way Mary's words tumbled out too fast when she repeated what she'd seen. At 1:11 p.m., 4 adults stood in the narrow corridor outside the basement door. Pastor Harper, his jaw clenched. Jim Hargrove, the head trustee and retired electrician whose hands were stained permanently gray from years at the steel plant. Elaine, breathing too quickly, her eyes already wet. And Mary, hugging herself, wishing she had never let Hannah go alone. The beige door stood closed. Both locks showed as unlatched, the slide bolt resting in its open position, the deadbolt turned so the flat edge pointed straight up. "Are you sure she went down?" Hargrove asked. Mary nodded, her voice small. "I saw her open the door, I heard it close." She said she was just getting the box with the posters for the bake sale. Jim reached for the knob, turned it, and pulled the door inward. The same breath of cool, stale air rolled up out of the darkness. The same switch at the top of the stairs clicked under his calloused thumb. Light bloomed at the bottom of the concrete steps. Jim descended slowly, each footfall echoing. The others waited at the top, listening to his progress as he stepped off the last stair and out of sight. For a long moment there was only the faint hum of the furnace and the far-off sound of a car starting up outside. Then Jim's voice floated back up the stairwell, strained and puzzled. "She's not down here." Over the next 10 minutes, the adults performed what would later be described in reports as an informal search of the church basement. Jim walked through the fellowship hall, where stacks of metal folding chairs lined the walls and tables were folded and leaned against a storage cove. He checked the kitchen with its ancient gas stove and industrial sinks, the craft room with its smell of glue and tempera paint, and the narrow hallway lined with Sunday school classrooms that hadn't been updated since the early 1960s. He peeked into the boiler room, ducking under a low lintel into the warm, clanging space where the building's heart beat in steel and steam. No one. No sounds except his own footsteps and the ticking of the pipes. No sign of a 17-year-old girl in a denim jacket. Up above, in the corridor by the basement door, the cluster of concerned adults had already grown. Word traveled fast in a small church. By 1:25 p.m., half a dozen members knew that Elaine's girl couldn't be found, and every mother present was suddenly aware of where her own children were, summoning them with sharp whispers and urgent hand gestures. When Jim reappeared at the top of the stairs at 1:28, his face was pale beneath his graying stubble. "She's not there," he said simply. "I checked every room. Twice." "She must have come back up," Mary protested, as if talking fast enough could undo the last half hour. "Maybe she came up a different way or went out another door. Maybe she went out front." But there was no other way. That was the thing everyone who knew the building understood instinctively, even before the police reports and floor plans and sworn statements. The church basement had a second exit, a fire door that opened out onto the narrow alley behind the building, but it was secured from the inside by a heavy push bar and from the outside by a rusted padlock. The trustees kept it chained on Sundays to prevent children from slipping out unnoticed. Even if Hannah had left that way, someone in the alley would have seen the door open. No one had. The only normal way in or out of the basement during services was the beige door at the end of the hallway. That door had not opened since Mary watched it close at 12:18. At 1:34 p.m., after a hurried and increasingly frantic search of the entire church building, someone finally said the words that should have been obvious but still felt unthinkable. "We need to call the police." Ashford did not have its own police department. The town relied on the county sheriff's office in Ridgefield, 10 miles away, for law enforcement. At 1:37 p.m., Pastor Harper dialed the non-emergency number from the church office, his voice steady but tight as he explained that a teenage girl had gone into the church basement more than an hour earlier and had not come out, that they had searched the building from top to bottom, that her mother was certain she was still in the building somewhere. The dispatcher on the other end, accustomed to weekend calls about fender benders and domestic arguments, asked the standard questions. Had she run away before? Did she have a boyfriend? Could she have left with friends? Was it possible she'd simply gone home? Harper answered each question as calmly as he could, feeling Elena's eyes on him, seeing in the reflection of the office window the pale faces of Mary and 2 other teenagers clustered behind him. No, Hannah was a good student. No, she did not have a history of running away. Yes, she had friends, but they were all still here. No one had seen her leave. Yes, they had checked the parking lot and the restrooms and every room in the building. Yes, they were sure. At 1:52 p.m., Deputy Sheriff Alan Pierce pulled his patrol car into the church parking lot, the tires crunching over wet gravel. A 29-year-old officer with 4 years on the job, Pierce had handled his share of missing teenager reports, almost all of which resolved within 24 hours, when angry parents located their children at a friend's house or the mall. As he walked up the slick stone steps to the church's side entrance, he expected to find a distraught mother, a pastor overreacting, and a girl who would turn up embarrassed 10 minutes into his search. Instead, he found 40 people clustered in the fellowship hall, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the hallway where the beige door stood slightly ajar, like the mouth of some patient animal. In the pastor's office, he listened to the story. He took down names, times, and descriptions, jotting notes in a small spiral pad. 17, 5'4", dark brown hair, green eyes, denim jacket, cream-colored sweater, brown corduroy skirt, scuffed white sneakers. Last seen at 12:17 p.m., walking alone down the hallway toward the basement door. At 12:18, the door closed behind her. No one had seen it open again. Pierce walked the hallway. He studied the door, its locks, its hinges. He opened it, flipped on the light, and descended into the basement. For the next 30 minutes, he performed the same search that Jim Hargrove had, but with the eyes of someone trained to look for signs of struggle, forced entry, or disturbance. He found none. The fellowship hall tables were stacked as usual. The kitchen counters were bare except for a roll of paper towels and a stack of coffee filters. The Sunday school rooms were as they always were, flannel graph boards leaning against walls, shelves of coloring books and crayons, low tables arranged in circles. The boiler room smelled of hot metal and dust, the sound of the furnace filling his ears. Pierce checked closets, crawled under tables, glanced up into the exposed ceiling joists as if expecting to find a secret hatch. Nothing. Back upstairs, he checked every exterior door, confirming what the trustees already knew. The front doors on Maple Street had been propped open after the service, but multiple congregants swore they had not seen Hannah come through. The side door by the parking lot, where the teenagers smoked and joked, had been in view of at least 3 people the entire time. None of them had seen her. The rear alley door from the basement was still chained and padlocked from the outside, the cold metal of the old lock slick beneath his gloved fingers. Inside, the push bar moved freely. There were no scuffs on the floor, no sign that anyone had recently pushed it open in panic or haste. At 3:06 p.m., with daylight already beginning to thin under the low November clouds, Deputy Pierce radioed in a formal missing person report to the county sheriff's office, his voice measured and professional as he spoke the words that would follow him for the rest of his career. Female juvenile, 17, last seen entering a secured church basement. Extensive search of building completed, no sign of exit, no indication of abduction or voluntary departure. Last known location, top of basement stairs, First Ashford Methodist Church, advised next steps. He did not say out loud what everyone in that building was already thinking. A girl had walked through a door and vanished from the face of the earth. The church basement door Deputy Alan Pierce would later describe the first hours of the investigation as a collision between logic and something that refused to fit inside logic, though he never used those words in any official report. At 3:11 p.m., as he stood in the narrow corridor staring at the beige basement door that had become the epicenter of Ashford's unease, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes behind him. The congregation gathered in anxious clusters in the fellowship hall and sanctuary, whispering, speculating, praying. The building felt different now, the familiar Sunday smells of coffee and perfume replaced by the sharp tang of fear that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Pierce walked the corridor again, trailing his gloved fingertips across the door frame, the painted hinges, the smooth wooden surface of the door. The locks were unremarkable, simple mechanical devices without signs of tampering. No scratches, no dents, no recent paint scrapes. Nothing to indicate that anyone had forced the door or manipulated it in any unusual way. Yet something had happened within this corridor, something that left no trace except absence. At 3:19 p.m., 2 additional deputies arrived from Ridgefield, their radios crackling, their boots thumping across the tile floor as they introduced themselves and began clearing the building again, room by room, this time with flashlights and the methodical caution reserved for situations where the unknown lurked just beyond the edge of visibility. They checked closets, rafters, crawl spaces, air vents. They tapped on walls, slid low under tables, shined beams into storage shelves stuffed with cardboard boxes. Their voices echoed through the church like calls across an empty canyon. "Hannah? Sheriff S. office. If you can hear us, say something." Silence answered again and again. At 3:47 p.m., one deputy climbed through a narrow access panel behind the boiler room, crawling on his stomach through accumulated dust and cobwebs while the furnace thumped and sighed beside him. He emerged 10 minutes later in the kitchen pantry, streaked with grime but shaking his head. No hidden chambers, no old coal chute, no forgotten dumbwaiter. Nothing. The building was exactly what it appeared to be. Exactly what it had been for a century, a place of sermons and children's programs and community suppers. A place where a teenage girl should not have been able to vanish. Outside, rain had begun falling again, a steady drizzle that darkened the gravel parking lot and blurred the bare branches of the maples standing guard over the church. At 4:03 p.m., Pierce stepped outside to clear his head and continue questioning congregants, though the questions felt increasingly futile. Every person he spoke to said the same thing. They had seen Hannah go toward the basement. They had not seen her come back. They had been in sight of the exits. They would have noticed a teenage girl in a denim jacket stepping into the rain. The church was a simple building with only 3 ways out, and all 3 had been under consistent, if unintentional, surveillance. Inside, Elaine Lewis sat at a folding table in the fellowship hall, clutching a wad of damp tissues, her eyes fixed on the basement hallway as if staring hard enough might conjure her daughter back into existence. Her husband, Tom, still wearing his work boots and jacket from an early morning shift at the mill, had arrived minutes earlier, summoned by a neighbor's frantic phone call. His normally stoic face had turned gray as he tried to piece together what he was hearing. His daughter, responsible to a fault, the girl who left handwritten notes on the refrigerator if she walked 2 blocks to the library, had somehow gone into a church basement and ceased to be. At 4:28 p.m., Sheriff Walter Donnelly arrived, his presence shifting the tone of the investigation instantly. Donnelly had worked in county law enforcement for 27 years, a thick-set man with silver hair and the calm patience of someone who had seen everything, or believed he had. He surveyed the building, the hallways, the doors, and the congregants with the measured gaze of a man building a picture in his mind. "Walk me through it," he told Pierce, and the deputy began recounting the timeline with the precision of someone who had played it on a loop in his mind since arriving. Donnelly listened without interrupting, his weathered face expressionless, as he studied the basement door. Then he descended the stairs himself, his heavy boots creating echoes that climbed the walls like restless spirits. When he returned, he closed the door behind him and stood for a long moment with his palm flat against the painted wood as if feeling for vibrations. "No one goes missing without a reason," he said quietly to Pierce. "So either she left this building and someone saw her, or she's still here and we haven't found her." "We tore this place apart," Pierce replied. "She's not in the building, then she left," Donnelly said. "Somehow." But even as he spoke, his eyes moved back to the door, betraying uncertainty. At 5:02 p.m., detectives from the county arrived. The rain had intensified, streaking the church windows and casting a watery gloom through the fellowship hall. The building's overhead lights buzzed faintly, sometimes flickering with the failing daylight. The detectives divided tasks. Some continued questioning members of the congregation while others searched outside, walking the perimeter of the church with flashlights, looking for footprints in the muddy gravel, tire tracks, discarded objects. They found nothing, no disturbed soil, no unusual impressions in the mud, no sign that anyone had been near the rear alley door in hours. One detective crawled beneath the wooden porch at the side of the building, illuminating old leaves and discarded hymnals from a past cleanup day. Nothing. At 5:26 p.m., the power flickered again. Several congregants gasped. In the fleeting dimness, the beige door at the end of the hallway seemed to grow darker, more imposing, as though aware of its role in the unfolding dread. At 5:31 p.m., Elaine stood and walked to Pierce, her voice shaking. "She's here. She has to be here. She wouldn't leave without telling me." "You're not looking in the right places." Pierce tried to reassure her, though he no longer believed his own words. They had looked everywhere. They had checked every space, every pipe chase, every closet, every corner of a building that had no secrets. And yet Hannah had not left the building. At 6:04 p.m., the detectives made the decision to evacuate all remaining congregants and lock down the church. They asked everyone to leave contact information and return home. Some protested, insisting they could help, but the sheriff remained firm. The building needed to be treated as a potential crime scene. By 6:22 p.m., only police and the Lewis family remained. The church felt larger now, emptier, the absence of chatter amplifying every creak, every rattle of the furnace, every distant drip of rain against brick. At 6:37 p.m., as deputies prepared to begin another full sweep, a strange sound echoed faintly through the building, a hollow metallic thud, followed by what sounded like the faint rush of moving air. Every head turned toward the basement door. Pierce stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously on his holster, and slowly pushed the door open. The stairwell yawned downward, lit only by the dim overhead bulb that flickered at the bottom of the stairs. The air drifting upward felt cooler than before, almost cold, as if the basement exhaled winter from some unseen cavity. "Did you hear that?" Pierce whispered. "Yeah," Donnelly said, his voice flat. "Check the boiler." They descended the stairs together, each step heavy, the sound of their boots vibrating in the narrow concrete shaft. They checked the boiler first. It hummed steadily, unchanged. They checked the fellowship hall. Silent. They checked the classrooms. Empty. The sound was not repeated. By 6:51 p.m., with the evening closing in and the rain turning to sleet, the sheriff made the call to bring in search and rescue dogs from the state police. The nearest unit was 45 minutes away. The Lewis family waited in the fellowship hall, their world collapsing hour by hour. Tom held Elaine's trembling hands. Mary sat alone at a table, staring at a half-eaten cookie left over from the morning's fellowship hour, the food now cold, the tablecloth damp from someone's spilled coffee. At 7:39 p.m., the K-9 unit arrived. The German shepherd trained to track missing persons sniffed Hannah's jacket retrieved from her bedroom earlier that afternoon and then was led to the basement door. The dog descended the stairs eagerly, paws tapping lightly on the concrete, tail rigid with focus. It sniffed the floor, the walls, the baseboards. Then, as the officers watched in confusion, the dog stopped in the middle of the basement hallway, lifted its head, and began whining. Not barking, not pulling toward a direction, just whining, looking upward at the ceiling as if searching for a scent that existed in a space it could not reach. "What does that mean?" Pierce asked. The handler shook his head, his brow furrowing. "She is here, or she was here. Then why isn't he tracking?" Because her trail ends, the handler said. It ends right here. The dog circled, sniffing again, whining louder. Then it walked to the bottom of the stairs, sat, and refused to move. At 8:04 p.m., Donnelly called off the dog search. The handler apologized repeatedly, insisting the behavior was highly unusual. Dogs didn't react that way without cause. At 8:17 p.m., the sheriff ordered a structural inspection of the church. Carpenters and contractors would be called in the morning. Walls might need to be opened, floorboards removed, crawl spaces expanded. Someone had to find the hidden place where Hannah had gone. At 8:42 p.m., Pierce stepped outside again to clear his head. The sleet tapped against his jacket like fingertips. The church rose behind him, glowing faintly from the tall windows, the building's silhouette jagged against the swirling gray sky. He turned back toward the basement windows, small rectangles of thick frosted glass set into the foundation. He crouched and shined his flashlight through one. He saw empty space. Concrete floor, folding chairs, dust motes drifting. No movement, no shadow, no sign of life, and no sign of a girl who should have been somewhere inside. At 9:11 p.m., after 9 hours of searching, Sheriff Donnelly gathered his deputies near the sanctuary doors. "We start again in the morning," he said quietly. "But for now, she is not here." The words felt like betrayal, like surrender to something that did not obey the rules of the world they knew. Jonathan Pierce, exhausted, leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. In the silence, the building creaked gently, the old wooden beams settling for the night. And somewhere deep inside the church, a faint sound so soft it could have been imagined echoed through the darkness like the distant, muffled click of a door latch gently falling into place. The church basement door. By morning, the sleet had hardened into a brittle crust that cracked under the boots of the officers who returned to First Ashford Methodist at 7:12 a.m. on November 7, 1983, the day after Hannah Lewis vanished from within its walls. The gray sky hung low over the church like a lid screwed too tightly onto an overfilled jar, and the building itself looked older than it had the night before, its bricks darkened by cold moisture, its stained glass windows streaked with frozen rain. Inside, the air was heavy with the sour smell of damp coats, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of unease that had seeped into the sanctuary and fellowship hall and refused to dissipate. Sheriff Donnelly arrived first, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a clipboard of forms he already knew would offer no answers. His boots echoed across the tiled corridor as he approached the beige basement door, feeling again the inexplicable tension emanating from that stretch of hallway, as though the building itself remembered and recoiled. He unlocked the door with deliberate calm and descended the stairs, the overhead bulb flickering weakly, casting long, thin shadows that trembled with each pulse of cold air from the vents. The basement looked exactly as it had the night before, table legs aligned like soldiers, chairs stacked neatly, children's artwork curled along bulletin boards. No overturned objects, no new disturbances, no sign that a human being had moved through the space in the last 12 hours. At 7:26 a.m., the structural inspector arrived, a weary man named Harold Greeley, who had spent 35 years crawling through old buildings and who believed that most mysteries could be explained by rotted beams, outdated fire escapes, and poorly recorded renovations. He set his metal toolbox on the concrete floor, adjusted his glasses, and began tapping along the basement walls with a rubber mallet. The hollow thuds echoed like heartbeats, steady and predictable. He moved room by room, methodically running his hands along seams, checking for warped beams, false walls, covered doors, anything that suggested a hidden cavity. Officers followed him, their flashlights cutting white slices through the dim basement. "Any chance of a sealed room?" Pierce asked, though the words felt foolish even in his own ears. "Not in this building," Greeley muttered. "These walls are solid masonry from the original construction. If someone sealed a room, you'd see the brickwork difference plain as the nose on your face." He tapped again, slower this time. Thud, thud, thud. Every sound was the same, solid, predictable, ordinary. By 8:14 a.m., Greeley declared the basement structurally unremarkable. No hidden spaces, he said, no voids, no collapses, no access points besides the stairwell and the alley door. If the girl's down here, which she isn't, she didn't get here through the walls. His words did nothing to ease the knot forming in Pierce's stomach. If the building had no secrets, then what they were facing was something even worse. A secret that had no physical explanation. At 8:32 a.m., volunteers arrived, men and women who refused to stay home, eyes rimmed red from a night of bad sleep or no sleep at all. Some brought food, some brought flashlights, some brought nothing but the grim determination of people searching for a child they had known since birth. Donnelly gathered them in the sanctuary and laid out the search plan. They would fan out through Ashford, combing the streets near the church, the bus stop, the schoolyard, the woods behind the mill. They would check culverts, sheds, abandoned garages, the banks of the Ashford River. They would search everywhere except the one place that had already been proven impossible and yet remained the most likely: the church basement. At 8:51 a.m., the first organized search group departed. Elaine and Tom Lewis did not join them. They sat in the front pew holding hands, facing the altar where their daughter had sung in the youth choir just 1 week earlier. Their faces had gone hollow, their eyes glassy with disbelief. They had not gone home. They had not slept. They were anchored in place as if afraid that leaving the building would sever the last thread holding Hannah to this world. At 9:17 a.m., Donnelly began interviewing those who had seen Hannah last. Mary repeated her account again, her voice monotone now from exhaustion. She had seen Hannah walk down the hallway. She had seen her open the door. She had heard the door close. She had not heard it open again. She had not seen Hannah since. Pastor Harper confirmed that the basement was empty when checked. Trustees confirmed the fire door in the alley had been secured. Multiple congregants confirmed that the exits had been visible, if not intentionally monitored. It was a perfect loop of testimonies, airtight in its consistency and maddening in its implications. At 9:43 a.m., Detective Karen Ballard arrived from the county office. She was younger than most detectives, sharp-eyed, direct, and not the type to tolerate talk of the inexplicable. She walked the hallway slowly, studying every inch of the beige door and its frame. She checked the hinges, the knob, the slide bolt, the deadbolt, the jamb. Then she crouched low and examined the small gap between the bottom of the door and the linoleum floor. If she went down there, Ballard said, she came back up. There's no other way. So the question is, who saw her come up? No one answered, no one could. At 10:02 a.m., Ballard made a decision that startled everyone. "We need to test the noise," she said. "If someone opens this door, how far away can you hear it?" She positioned officers at various points in the building, some in the sanctuary, some in the fellowship hall, some near the parking lot door. Then she opened the basement door, first slowly, then quickly, then slammed it shut. Each officer reported the same. The noise carried. The hinges groaned loudly. No one could have opened or closed the door during the service without at least 3 or 4 people hearing it, which meant Hannah had not come back up. Not without producing a sound. Not unless she had floated or vanished or become something that made no noise at all. At 10:37 a.m., as officers prepared to re-examine the basement for the 4th time, a faint vibration rippled through the floor. Not enough to startle anyone, just enough to silence them. It felt like a shiver running through the building itself. "What was that?" Pierce asked. No one answered. They listened. The vibration came again, a dull, soft thrum beneath the floorboards. The kind of sound one might hear if someone far below were knocking on a hollow piece of wood. The kind of sound a buried voice might make if it were trying to reach the surface. Pierce and Ballard exchanged a glance. Then they moved, walking quickly toward the basement door as the vibration pulsed a third time, slightly louder, slightly sharper, as if whatever made the sound was drawing closer. At 10:41 a.m., they opened the door. Cold air rose again, sharper than before, cutting up the stairwell like a blade. The basement was dim, the overhead bulb flickering. The vibration stopped. Ballard descended one step at a time, her flashlight beam scanning the floor, the walls, the shadows. She reached the bottom and froze. "Pierce," she whispered, "you need to see this." He joined her, breath tight, heart hammering. On the concrete floor near the base of the stairs lay a small object. A white canvas sneaker, scuffed, size 6, a thin smear of dirt across the toe, the laces tied neatly, the kind of shoe a 17-year-old girl would wear to church on a rainy November morning. The kind of shoe Hannah Lewis had been wearing when she disappeared. It had not been there last night, and there were no footprints leading to it. It rested perfectly clean on the dusty concrete, as though it had simply appeared, or been placed. At 10:43 a.m., Ballard spoke the words that chilled every officer in the basement. "Someone is putting things back." The furnace hissed, the overhead bulb flickered, and from somewhere deeper in the basement where no one had been able to find a single place for a girl to hide came a faint sound, sharp, metallic, deliberate, the unmistakable click of a small metal object being placed gently upon a hard surface. Then silence, complete and suffocating, and Hannah's single shoe sitting in the cold, dim light like an accusation against the laws of the physical world. The church basement door. The discovery of the shoe changed the temperature of the investigation in an instant. At 10:44 a.m. on November 7, 1983, the basement no longer felt like a place that had failed to yield a missing girl. It felt like a place actively involved in keeping her hidden. Detective Ballard crouched beside the sneaker, her breath fogging slightly in the cold air that hovered near the floor, and reached out with two gloved fingers to lift it. The canvas was cold, unnaturally cold, as though it had been stored not in an empty basement room but in a freezer. She turned it slowly, examining the sole. No dust, no water, no grit from the church steps, nothing to indicate it had touched the ground since Hannah had worn it. "Wherever it came from," Ballard whispered, "it wasn't walked here." At 10:47 a.m., Sheriff Donnelly, Pierce, and two deputies began sweeping the basement again. But the atmosphere had shifted. Their flashlights cut through the dimness like hesitant blades, revealing nothing new but illuminating the sense that something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of the beam. Every step echoed a fraction of a second too long, as if the sound bounced off surfaces that should not have existed. The metallic noise they had heard moments earlier remained a mystery. No object was out of place. No tool or piece of equipment had fallen or been moved. Nothing explained the sound. By 11:02 a.m., the shoe was bagged and catalogued, though everyone involved felt that placing it into an evidence bag was like trying to tame something that had slipped past the rules of evidence entirely. Ballard addressed the officers in a tight, level voice. "If that shoe appeared here, then someone either entered this basement without being seen, or something in this building is happening that we don't understand. Either option means we continue until we find the breach." But there was no breach. At 11:14 a.m., the search groups outside returned to report they had found nothing. No footprints, no belongings, no witness who had seen a disoriented teenage girl walking the streets in wet weather. The mill road was empty except for truck traffic. The woods behind the water tower were quiet except for the chatter of late autumn birds. The riverbank was muddy and undisturbed. Nothing. At 11:29 a.m., Donnelly ordered the furnace to be shut off in case vibration or airflow was masking some sound within the building. 2 trustees descended into the boiler room and switched off the system. The hum that had been a constant presence since morning faded out, leaving a hollow, unnatural silence so complete that officers instinctively held their breath, waiting for the building to adjust. It did not. The silence lingered, thick and deliberate, as though the building were listening. At 11:38 a.m., standing in the unease of the newly quiet basement, Pierce noticed something new. The air itself had changed. It no longer felt simply cold. It felt pressurized, as if something below or behind the walls was drawing the air inward, pulling it, holding it. He stepped into the fellowship hall space and stood still. After several seconds, he felt it again, a faint tug, a subtle pull of air toward the far wall near the shelving where old Christmas pageant costumes were stored in plastic bins. "Do you feel that?" he asked Ballard. She joined him, closing her eyes to heighten her senses. The pull was faint, but there, steady, like the whisper of a draft funneled through a crack too small to see. "Air doesn't move like that unless it is going somewhere," Ballard murmured. "But there's no vent behind this wall." Greeley, the inspector, was summoned again. At 11:52 a.m., he ran his hands along the cinderblock wall, tapping with his mallet, checking seams, checking paint for inconsistencies. Everything looked uniform. Yet when he held a thin strip of tissue near the wall, the tissue fluttered, pulled inward, toward solid masonry. "That is not possible," Greeley said. "There's no cavity here, no draft path, no vents. The airflow is coming from behind solid block." At 12:03 p.m., as they debated demolishing part of the wall, a sharp clang rang through the basement, loud, metallic, unmistakable. Not from the far rooms, not from the stairwell. From directly behind the cinderblock wall that Greeley insisted had no space behind it. The officers froze. A second clang came, softer, almost hesitant, followed by a dragging sound like metal scraping concrete. "Get the tools," Donnelly ordered, and deputies ran upstairs for crowbars and sledgehammers. At 12:11 p.m., the first sledgehammer strike reverberated through the basement, cracking the brittle paint but not the block beneath. The second strike chipped a corner. The third made a thin spiderweb fracture. The sound from behind the wall repeated again, 3 quick metallic taps, each one echoing too long and too sharp, like something calling out from a chamber that shouldn't exist. At 12:19 p.m., after nearly 10 minutes of blows, the first brick loosened. Dust burst outward in a pale cloud, and cold air surged from the opening so violently that the officers staggered back. It was an Arctic blast, colder than any unheated church basement had any right to be. "What the hell?" Pierce murmured. Ballard aimed her flashlight into the opening. At first, the beam illuminated only floating dust. Then gradually it found depth. A space. A void where solid wall should have been. A narrow cavity stretching downward, impossibly deep, swallowing the light as though the walls drank it. "This wasn't on any blueprint," Greeley said, voice shaking, his certainty collapsing. "This cavity didn't exist. It's not structurally possible for it to exist. The foundation doesn't allow for it." "It exists now," Ballard said. At 12:23 p.m., deputies expanded the opening. More cinder blocks cracked, more cold air poured out. The cavity beyond widened enough to reveal rough stone, dirt, and something else, metal. A thin metal bar, the source of the earlier scraping sound. And next to it, lodged in the dirt, something white. Pierce crouched, reached in with gloved hands, and retrieved the object. A sock. White, thin, folded into itself as though someone had pulled it from their foot in a hurry. The same size as the shoe. The cotton was cold, damp, and speckled with tiny grains of soil that did not match the basement floor. At 12:26 p.m., Donnelly made the decision. "We re-going in." Ballard nodded. Pierce swallowed hard. No one wanted to say what they were thinking, that a 17-year-old girl could not have created a space like this, could not have broken through concrete, could not have vanished into a void that appeared overnight. And yet the shoe, the sock, the cold air, the noise, the cavity, they all pointed toward the same impossible truth. At 12:31 p.m., with flashlights, ropes, and gloves, the first officer leaned through the broken wall and lowered himself into the opening. The stone beneath his boots shifted slightly as though disturbed for the first time in decades or minutes. Ballard followed. Pierce went third. The air grew colder with every inch they descended. At 12:34 p.m., as they reached a narrow landing in the darkness, the flashlight beams finally found something on the dirt floor that made all three officers stop breathing at once. A handprint, small, delicate, pressed deeply into the soil. The handprint faced upward as though reaching toward the opening in the wall. Fresh, unsmudged, impossible. Hannah Lewis had been here, very recently, and the direction of the fingers suggested something even worse. She had not crawled deeper into the cavity. She had crawled upward, toward the wall that had been sealed until minutes ago, as if she had been a foot away from the officers while they were on the other side, hammering at the cinder blocks, as if she had been waiting. At 12:35 p.m., before anyone could speak, a sound rose from the darkness below, a sound that did not belong to wind or shifting stone, a soft, shaky breath, human, weak, and very, very close. Then the voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the cold air. A whisper that climbed up the stone walls like a dying echo. "Help, please," Ballard's flashlight shook. Pierce's mouth went dry. Donnelly's voice cracked as he shouted down into the darkness, "Hannah! Hannah, we here!" The voice came again, a whisper, a whimper, a plea. "Help me, he's still here." And then, from somewhere deeper in the void, a second sound emerged. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Footsteps, not hers. The church basement door. The moment the second set of footsteps echoed up from the blackness beneath them, every officer froze as if the darkness itself had reached up and gripped their throats. It was a slow, weighty rhythm, unmistakably human, undeniably deliberate, and impossibly close. The narrow cavity amplified the sound, sending it spiraling up the rough stone walls so that no one could tell how far below the source actually stood. Ballard's hand hovered near her holster, her flashlight trembling in the cold, her breath shallow. Pierce felt every instinct in his body scream, "Retreat! Retreat now! Get out! Get back to the world where things made sense." But Hannah's voice was still drifting upward in faint gasps, ragged and terrified, and the officers knew they could not leave her in that suffocating dark. Sheriff Donnelly steadied his voice. Every light down, everyone quiet. The officers complied. Flashlights angled downward, ropes taut, boots steady on loose soil. The air felt thick enough to push against their chests. "Hannah," Donnelly called again, softer. "We were coming. Stay where you are." A weak sob answered. Then silence. Then faintly the sound of something scraping against stone as though a hand or shoe slid across the wall in an attempt to stand or shift position. Then the footsteps resumed, but not closer, not moving away, just pacing, slow, heavy, rhythmic, back and forth in the dark beneath them. "There's somebody else down there," Pierce whispered, his mouth dry. But how the hell did he get in? Ballard's eyes darted around the narrow cavity, same way she did. However she got down here, he was with her. But nothing about that made sense. No one had seen Hannah enter anything but the basement door. No other entry existed, no access, no tunnels. The inspectors had been certain, the blueprints confirmed it. Yet here they were, standing above a void that shouldn't exist, listening to a man pacing below them in a chamber that had never appeared on any map. At 12:36 p.m., they descended another 2 feet to a broader ledge. The cavity opened slightly, widening just enough to reveal a slope of irregular stones and packed earth leading downward. The air grew colder, biting at their faces with each breath. Ballard aimed her flashlight into the dark and caught a brief glimmer of something metallic far below a reflection, quick and sharp, gone before she could angle the beam properly. "You see that?" she whispered. Pierce nodded. Metal, something shiny. It could have been anything, a tool, a weapon, a pair of glasses, a bracelet, a door hinge, or something stranger. The pacing footsteps stopped suddenly. The silence dropped over them like a sheet. And then from the darkness, a voice, not Hannah S., a man-s voice, low, calm, close. "You shouldn't have opened the wall." Ballard's breath hitched. Pierce stiffened. Donnelly tightened his grip on the rope anchoring them to the opening above. "Sir," Donnelly called, keeping his tone authoritative, "this is the County Sheriff's Department. Identify yourself." Silence. Not even breathing. Pierce's flashlight beam followed the slope downward. "Come on," he whispered to Ballard. "We need to get down there." "We're not going blind into that," she hissed. But they had no choice. Hannah was below them, injured, cold, terrified. At 12:37 p.m., Donnelly gave the order. "Ballard, Pierce, with me. Slow descent. Everyone else stays at the breach." They lowered themselves further into the cavity, boots scraping against stone, flashlights trembling in the cold. The slope leveled into a narrow earthen ledge about 4 feet wide. The stone walls curved inward like a natural cave, but the shape was too uniform, too intentional to be geological. Something had been carved here. Something old. Something secret. At 12:39 p.m., they saw her, Hannah Lewis, lying on her side near the far wall, half-curled, one socked foot exposed, the other bare where her shoe had been removed. Her hair hung damp around her face. Her clothes were dirty, her skin pale, her breathing shallow but audible. Her eyes fluttered. "Hannah," Ballard whispered, moving forward, "it's okay. We were here." But Donnelly grabbed her arm. "Wait." Because Hannah wasn't alone. 5 feet to her right, partially hidden in shadow, stood a man. Or something shaped like a man. The flashlight beams trembled over him, revealing only fragments. A dark jacket coated with dust, one sleeve torn, boots caked with soil that did not match the basement floor, and a face turned just slightly away but pale, too pale, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes glinted when the beam caught them. Not in fear, not in surprise, in recognition, as though he had been waiting. "Step away from her," Donnelly ordered, voice rock steady despite the chill crawling up his spine. The man did not move, did not speak, did not blink. He simply turned his head more fully toward them, and when he did, something inside Pierce's gut twisted. Not because the man looked monstrous, but because he didn't. He looked utterly ordinary, mid-30s, brown hair, plain features, forgettable. But the eyes, those eyes, did not belong in the face of someone from Ashford, Pennsylvania, or from anywhere that obeyed the rules of sunlight and normal life. They were lifeless, old, empty, as if they had seen something they were never meant to see. "Sir," Ballard said slowly, "we here to help her. We taking her out, back away." The man finally spoke. She wasn't supposed to see the door open. His voice was dull, flat, emotionless, but she did. Ballard's grip on her flashlight tightened. "What door?" He blinked. Once. Slowly. "The basement door," he said. "The one you opened. The one I came through." Pierce whispered, "Oh, God." Because the basement door hadn't opened since Hannah entered. Everyone had been certain. They had tested the sound. They had monitored the exits. The door hadn't opened. Not once. Not for anyone. And yet here was a man standing in a sealed cavity beneath the church, claiming he had walked through it. "Sir," Donnelly said, sharply. Move away from her. The man tilted his head in a slow, unnatural angle. You broke the wall, he said softly. That's not how you were supposed to come in. At 12:41 p.m., the Ballard lunged. The man stepped backward into deeper darkness. The flashlight beams followed him automatically. He moved with unnatural speed, slipping behind a narrow column of stone, vanishing into a slice of shadow too thin for any adult to fit through. Ballard reached the spot seconds later and shined her beam into the gap. It was solid, stone, no passage, no space. He's gone, Pierce whispered. He's just gone. Donnelly drew a shaky breath. Get the girl. At 12:43 p.m., they reached Hannah. She flinched weakly when Ballard touched her shoulder but did not resist. Her voice came out as a cracked whisper. He took me. He said I had to stay quiet. He said the door wasn't for me. It's okay, Ballard murmured, lifting her gently. We were getting you out. No. Hannah whimpered, eyes wide with terror. No, you don't understand. He's still here. We know, Pierce said. We saw him. No, Hannah cried softly. Not him. The officers exchanged a glance. There's someone else, Hannah whispered. He said he wasn't the first. He said others came before him. She clutched Ballard's sleeve with freezing fingers. He said once you open the door, it doesn't close again. And then from deep below, the footsteps returned. Not one set, several, slow, heavy, approaching, climbing, coming toward them. And the cold air rose like a breath exhaled by the darkness itself. The church basement door, the footsteps multiplied until they were no longer separate sounds but a single layered vibration rising from the earth. The steady cadence of many feet moving in unison through a space none of them had known existed an hour earlier. The cold that followed climbed the stone walls like a living thing, seeping into cloth, into skin, into bone, cold so deep and sudden that every officer felt their muscles clench as if bracing for impact. Ballard tightened her hold on Hannah, pulling the half-conscious girl against her chest, while Donnelly steadied himself and raised his flashlight toward the slope below. The beam trembled across the darkness, illuminating only the curving stone, the uneven floor, the settling dust. Nothing visible, nothing moving. Yet the footsteps continued steady, organized as though a silent procession advanced toward the narrow ledge where the rescuers stood. At 12:44 p.m., the first shape appeared. Pierce saw it before the others, a faint silhouette shifting in the deepest part of the shadow, subtly displacing the darkness rather than emerging from it, as if the figure had been waiting for their light to acknowledge its presence before stepping closer. There, Pierce whispered. Ballard's flashlight swung toward the shape. The beam washed over a face. No, not a full face, half of one, pale and indistinct, as though carved from unfired clay and left unfinished. The eyes were hollow impressions, dark cavities with no shine or reflection. The rest of the head and the body remained obscured in shadow, suggesting more shape than substance. Donnelly stepped forward instinctively, then froze as a second figure shifted beside the first. And another. And another. 4 shapes now crowded the bottom of the slope, each half visible, each half formed, each vibrating slightly at the edges as though struggling to maintain their outlines under the flashlight beams. They were not walking. They were waiting. Back up, Donnelly whispered, slowly. The officers began to retreat toward the breach in the wall, pulling Hannah with them. But the ledge was narrow, the slope unstable, the air thick with cold, and the cluster of shapes below made upward movement feel like trying to swim through concrete. The footsteps continued. But now they were above as well. From behind the cinder-block wall, from inside the basement, from the fellowship hall, from the sanctuary. Slow, measured steps, footfalls pressing on floors that should have been empty. We need to move, Ballard hissed. Now! At 12:45 p.m., they lifted Hannah, bracing her weight between Ballard and Pierce while Donnelly kept his flashlight fixed on the shapes below. The figures did not advance. They simply shifted, as though adjusting their positions in anticipation. The officers climbed. Stone crumbled under their boots. Soil slid. The cavity felt narrower than it had mere minutes before, as if the walls themselves flexed inward. Halfway up the rise, Hannah gasped a soft, sharp inhalation. "Don T, look at them," she whispered. "That is what he said." Don T looked back. Ballard tightened her grip. "We were getting you out. Keep your eyes on me." But Hannah S. gaze darted over Ballard S. shoulder as a faint new sound rose from the darkness below. Not footsteps, breathing, slow, rhythmic, collective, as though the figures inhaled and exhaled as a single entity. At 12:46 p.m., one of the shapes broke formation and stepped forward. It stepped fully into the light, and the officers understood instantly that it was not a man. It had the structure of a man, arms, legs, head, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too still. The mouth, a faint horizontal smear below the half-formed nose, began to widen. Slowly, cleanly, too smoothly for flesh. When it spoke, the voice did not match the movement. It came from everywhere at once, from the cavity, from the basement above, from behind the walls, from beneath the floorboards. She opened the door. The voice was flat, empty, a declaration, not an accusation. "You opened the door." At 12:47 p.m., the ledge trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling of the cavity, raining lightly onto the officers' shoulders. Donnelly shouted upward, "Pull us up! Now!" Two deputies at the opening threw down additional rope, their faces pale and wide-eyed as they strained to pull Ballard, Pierce, Donnelly, and Hannah upward. The rope tightened. The cavity groaned. The shapes below began to move, not advancing, not climbing, but shifting as though preparing to ascend. At 12:48 p.m., Pierce felt something cold brush against the back of his boot. He jerked upward violently, nearly slipping, and when he looked down, he saw a pale hand, too long, too smooth, retract slowly into the dark. "Move!" he shouted, his voice breaking. The deputies hauled them upward, inches at a time, the officers climbing desperately as the cold deepened and the shapes gathered below, their breathing growing louder, more in sync, more purposeful. At 12:49 p.m., Ballard reached the breach in the wall, pushing Hannah into waiting arms. Pierce scrambled through next, scraping his hands raw on broken cinder block. Donnelly followed, panting, his flashlight beam sliding wildly across the cavity as he backed out. The shape stood at the base of the slope, motionless now, watching or sensing the officer's retreat. One raised its head, one raised an arm, one tilted its long, unfinished face. Then the cold surged again, violent and sudden, and the cavity exhaled a gust of frigid air strong enough to extinguish two of the officers' flashlights. The last thing Pierce saw before the light went out was the nearest figure stepping forward, raising its hand toward the breach as though it intended to climb through after them. At 12:50 p.m., the deputies slammed boards across the opening, their hands shaking, their breath tearing through their lungs. "Seal it!" Donnelly barked. "Seal it now!" Hammers struck wood, nails drove into cinder block, dust filled the air. Behind the boards, deep in the cavity, the footsteps resumed slow, heavy, ascending. At 12:51 p.m., Hannah spoke again, her voice small, trembling but horribly clear. "It doesn't matter if you close it," she whispered. "He said once the door opens, it looks for another way out." And from somewhere inside the church, far from the basement wall, far from the boarded breach, far from the officers catching their breath, another door hinge groaned. A slow, deliberate creak, coming from the sanctuary, as though something upstairs had just stepped through the church basement door. The sanctuary door should not have made that sound, not with every officer accounted for, not with the building locked down, not with the entire congregation sent home hours earlier. But at 12:52 p.m. on November 7, 1983, the groan of ancient hinges rolled through the church like a warning bell, echoing along the high arched ceiling of the sanctuary and bleeding into the hallway where the officers stood pale and motionless, boards pressed fresh against the fractured basement wall. No one spoke. No one breathed. The sound had come from above, long and slow, as if the door separating the sanctuary from the foyer had been pushed open by a careful, deliberate hand. Donnelly broke first. He raised his flashlight and stepped into the corridor without waiting for backup, his boots thudding quietly across the linoleum. Ballard was beside him in seconds, Pierce just behind, Hannah's trembling form supported by two deputies near the fellowship hall entrance. The corridor felt colder than the basement now, the air heavy with a tension that pressed against their lungs. The sanctuary door stood half open at the far end of the hall. It hadn't been that way when they first descended into the cavity. Every officer knew it. No one had touched it. No one had gone near it. At 12:53 p.m., Donnelly approached it slowly, flashlight aimed into the dark sanctuary. The beam stretched across the pews, the pulpit, the altar, the stained glass windows filtering gray daylight through blues and reds. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but the cold was unmistakable. The sanctuary had the chill of a stone cellar. "Lights," Donnelly ordered. Pierce found the switch and flipped it. The overhead pendant lights sputtered, flickered twice, then surged to life, revealing the sanctuary in full. Empty. Silent, perfectly arranged, except for the shape standing beside the front pew. It was faint, pale, almost transparent in the harsh overhead lights. The proportions were wrong again, too long, too still, too smooth. But this figure was more complete than the ones they had seen in the cavity. A face beginning to form, features sharpening, a body shaping itself out of the cold air. Ballard inhaled sharply, raising her firearm. The moment she did, the figure turned its head, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with recognition, as though it already knew every person in the room, as though it had been watching them long before they'd have found the cavity. "Hands in the air," Donnelly commanded, though part of him already knew the command meant nothing to something like this. The figure did not move. Then it did something far worse. It smiled, slowly, cleanly, with a mouth that had not been fully visible a moment before. The smile widened, revealing no teeth, just a dark curve in a face that was still shaping itself. A whisper followed, low and echoing as though spoken by many voices layered into one. "You opened the wall." The same words as below, the same flat tone, but this time accompanied by movement. The figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its feet making no sound on the carpeted aisle. "Back!" Donnelly snapped. "Back now!" The officers retreated, pulling Hannah toward the fellowship hall. But the figure did not quicken. It did not lunge. It advanced with the confidence of something that knew it did not need to hurry. At 12:55 p.m., the stained glass windows along the sanctuary's east wall flickered not from outside light but from inside motion. Shadows passed behind the glass. More shapes, more figures forming in the cold air. Pierce's heart hammered painfully. "They re everywhere," he whispered, the sanctuary filled with a low hum, not mechanical, not electrical. A human hum, many voices exhaling together, inhaling together, a slow, synchronized breath like something waking up after a long sleep. Ballard grabbed Hannah's wrist. "Move!" They ran, down the corridor, past the fellowship hall, toward the parking lot doors. But when they reached the rear exit, the metal bar refused to budge, as though held by a force on the other side, or by none at all. At 12:56 p.m., Donnelly ordered every officer to the front entrance. They sprinted through the hall, boots pounding the tile, flashlights jerking wildly as they pulled Hannah along. Behind them, the hum grew louder. The footsteps multiplied again, not frantic, not chaotic, steady, rhythmic, pursuing. They reached the front vestibule. Pierce pushed the wooden doors. stiff, heavy, then open. A blast of cold outside air hit them. Snowflakes whipped through the doorway despite it being a clear, dry day minutes earlier. They shoved Hannah through, then spilled out onto the stone steps. But the cold followed them. The temperature outside dropped abruptly, air crystallizing into visible puffs as the officers exhaled. Donnelly turned back toward the sanctuary. The figure had reached the vestibule. Behind it, more shapes gathered, half-formed and motionless, watching with hollow eyes. Not attacking, not rushing, watching. The lead figure stepped through the sanctuary threshold, its form stabilizing slightly as it crossed into the vestibule. Donnelly lifted his firearm again. "Stay back." The figure tilted its head. "This place opened the door," it whispered. "It remembers." Pierce grabbed Donnelly's shoulder. "Sheriff, we need to go now." Donnelly hesitated only a fraction of a second before backing through the exterior doors, the cold air slicing his lungs as he stepped outside. At 12:58 p.m., every officer piled into the parking lot. Real snow swirled around them despite no precipitation in the forecast. Hannah clung weakly to Ballard's arm, barely conscious. "Dante, let them touch me," she whispered. "Please, Dante, let them take me back." "We won, T," Ballard said, though she wasn't sure. They reached the patrol cars. Engines roared to life, doors slammed, tires skidded on the thin layer of sudden frost. At 12:59 p.m., Sheriff Donnelly looked back at the church. The sanctuary doorway was still open. The shape stood just inside the threshold, unmoving, as though obeying some invisible boundary they were not permitted to cross. Their hollow eyes watched the patrol cars leave. Their half-formed faces tilted upward. Their breath, if it could be called breath, spilled into the air as a visible mist. Then, as the last cruiser reached the end of Maple Street, the front doors of First Ashford Methodist slowly, quietly closed themselves. At 1:04 p.m., the building was empty again. Silent. Ordinary from the outside, but the Lewis girl had been found. She was alive, and something else had awakened with her. In the days that followed, the church was sealed off. Investigators came from the county, then the state, then from agencies that never introduced themselves. The cavity behind the wall was gone when they returned. Solid masonry again, untouched. The boards remained nailed into place, but behind them the wall showed no fracture, no gap, no signs of tampering. The shoe and sock were catalogued, photographed, stored. They showed no trace abnormalities except for the impossibly cold temperature that had never quite left them. Hannah spent 3 days in the hospital. She spoke only once about what she saw. "There are doors that aren't supposed to open," she whispered. "And places that aren't supposed to be found." When asked who took her, she said only, "Not him. He was trapped too. They all were." When asked what they were, Hannah stared past the officer into the corner of the room. "Hungry," she whispered, "and waiting." On November 15, 1983, the federal agencies withdrew. The church remained closed. The Lewis family moved away. Hannah never returned to Ashford. But the building stood for another 7 years, shuttered and silent, until a lightning strike in 1990 burned it to its foundation. The official report cited faulty wiring and structural weakness. But those who responded to the fire, the ones who had been there in 1983, told the same story behind closed doors. That as the flames spread, something moved inside the church. Not people, not animals, shapes, half-formed, watching through the stained glass windows until the heat melted their faces into twisting colors. When the church collapsed in on itself, a sound rose from the ruins, a long exhale, like a door sealing shut. And for the first time in 7 years, the air above Ashford felt warm again. The case of Hannah Lewis was officially closed. But everyone who had been there the day she was found in the cavity beneath the basement carried the same truth quietly for the rest of their lives. Some doors dawned to open to let things out. They open to let things in. And once opened, they never forget the path.